Hello and welcome to Star USA Training. Today is Tuesday, April 7th, and we're diving into Incoterms rules for 2020. Whether you're joining us live or watching the recording back, we appreciate you being here. If you're attending live, we encourage you to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from today. We also invite you to connect with Star USA on LinkedIn. We are focusing on growing our presence this year by sharing valuable content, including industry insights, updates, articles, and training opportunities. We'd love to connect with you, and if you feel comfortable, feel free to drop your LinkedIn profile in chat as well so we can continue the conversation beyond today's session. This session is being recorded. After the webinar, we'll upload the recording, slides, and any additional materials to our website. If you registered for the webinar, you will receive an email link once all those resources become available. For those looking for continuing education credits, we'll provide a CE code at the end of this webinar. This session qualifies for one CE credit for licensed customs brokers and those with the CCS credentials through NCBFAA. Please be sure to save the code given at the end of the session. If you're watching this back on YouTube later, there will be a different code in use for recorded sessions. We encourage you to stay engaged throughout today's session. If you have questions, drop them in the chat at any time. We've set aside time at the end to address as many questions as possible and help you navigate any challenges that you're facing. And lastly, a quick disclaimer. While I am a licensed customs broker, today's discussion is informational only and should not be considered legal advice or the transaction of customs business on your behalf. If you need additional help after this webinar on Incoterms, there is going to be a quick survey at the end about a potential live session on Incoterms. And as always, if you have questions, you're welcome to email us after the session. And with that said, a quick introduction of me. I am Michael Easton. I am the president and general manager of Star USA. I'm a licensed customs broker. I've been in the business for more than 20 years. Star USA has been in business since '96. We provide all manner of support for international businesses on regulatory and international trade matters. A brief overview of some of the things that we deal with on the daily are on the slide before you today. Star USA has been proud to serve the international trade community through educating and empowering individuals to succeed at their roles and in their jobs. We very much appreciate the connections that we get to create. So if you'd like to reach out or build your network, please feel free to reach out to us. So today we'll be discussing what Incoterms rules are and what they are not, how they serve businesses and their partners, what happens if we don't use Incoterms rules correctly, and what are some of the common mistakes companies make when using Incoterms rules? Quite a few people sent in questions ahead of this session, so I have those also captured at the end to try and address some of the real world things that people are dealing with. Incoterms rules are part of a global strategy to align communication both internally and with customers and suppliers around the world. So they're an essential tool for succeeding in international trade. Before we dive too deeply into this, I want to launch a quick poll on your relationship with Incoterms presently. So the question is, what is your relationship with Incoterms? What are they? I always swipe left. Out of sight, out of mind. I never remember to use them. I can't tell them apart. All those letters look the same to me. Trust me, I've been there. We've tried to make it work, but they don't live up to the hype. It's been going well, and I'm glad they're part of my life. It's the best thing ever. I couldn't imagine a world without them. I'll give you another about 15, 20 seconds to finish, select your answer here, and then I'll share the results so that we can see where everybody's coming from. Okay. And I'm going to share the results on the screen, hopefully. It looks like most of us are pretty familiar with Incoterms and how they work, falling into the it's been going well, and I'm glad they're there. I see some people are struggling with getting them to work for their business, and some of us are trying to learn about Incoterms for the very first time. This is a pretty split mix. It helps me understand sort of the situations that you're in. So we'll kind of try and focus a lot on trying to maximize how Incoterms work for the business as we go through the discussion today. Okay. So with that being said, I will be going through an introduction to Incoterms. So those of you that are less familiar with what they are and how they work, we'll get some of the background that has led us to Incoterms 2020 rules that are in use today in 2025. We'll talk about the rules themselves and how they work in practice, what they're meant to do. And then we'll take a look at and have some conversation about using those rules and making them work for your business. So first, the history and background. Incoterms started with a 1920 study that demonstrated there was a lack of uniformity in trading practices between countries. 1920, just over 100 years ago, international commerce was only just really becoming prevalent in the global stage. And as people were trying to trade goods between countries, there was a lot of challenges. People used terms differently. Even within the same country, their understanding of certain phrases would lead to confusion, miscommunication, and misunderstanding. And eventually that led to disputes and litigation for who's going to cover which costs or who was supposed to be shouldering which responsibilities. So the Incoterms were born out of that. Incoterms, the word stands for an international commercial terms, INCO terms. The Incoterms rules are not laws. They're updated every 10 years, and we're currently on the Incoterms 2020 revision. There are 11 rules total. 7 are in use for any mode of transportation, and 4 are for waterway only. And we'll talk about some of those waterway only ones and how they create additional confusion, particularly with US companies. The Incoterms are created by the International Chamber of Commerce, headquartered in Paris, France. So there's a group of international people who get together, form a committee, and negotiate and set the Incoterms every 10 years. Without Incoterms in play, the price of international business tends to go way up, making it harder for economies to grow, and it slows global development. The current industry practices look at for Incoterms 2020 are looking at changes in documentation requirements globally, changes in transportation and supply chain methodologies, as well as international policies and import-export responsibilities, including supply chain security considerations. So it's important to keep abreast of the new changes, to seeing how the world is going right now. I would expect Incoterms 2030 to be paying much more attention to tariffs and how those impact the trade between countries. So what's new in 2020? The guidance notes were renamed as explanatory notes and were much simplified. Please do not confuse this with the harmonized system explanatory notes. They are very different things. The World Customs Organization has no relationship to the International Chamber of Commerce. So Incoterms and harmonized system are different, but they both use explanatory notes now. The match columns for the explanatory notes are arranged in order of importance and by the flow of goods, which is very, very useful. And it's now consistent across Incoterms rules, both in presentation and framing, so that you can compare and contrast one rule to another rule and get apples to apples. The Incoterms rules were better designed to be applicable to domestic transport. Whenever you have a in-country movement of goods, you can just safely ignore the international components of that Incoterm rule, and all the other aspects will still be in effect. The insurance coverage was redefined for CIP and CIF terms. For CIF, the minimum cover the insurance coverage is set to minimum cover unless agreed differently. So that's same as Class C or free of particular average. And for CIP, the default insurance coverage is maximum cover unless agreed differently, which is Class A or all risk. So CIP and CIF have different presumptions of insurance coverage. And as always, those are the only two Incoterms rules that specifically address insurance. There's better acknowledgement and addressing of security requirements. From 9/11 really triggered a major reevaluation of how security is addressed with global commerce. Things like CTPAT and authorized economic operators programs sprung up to specifically address those security requirements, and Incoterms are beginning to fold those into the terminology when they come into play. And lastly, they replaced the DAT term with DPU. DAT used to stand for deliver at terminal. DPU is now delivered at place unloaded. So effectively the same rule, but clarified in its meaning. As always, the best tool for navigating the Incoterms rules directly is going to be the actual book published by the International Chamber of Commerce, the ICC. You can buy it directly from them for 45 euros at the link on this slide. Again, which you'll get the slides after the session, so you'll have a copy of these and you can go directly to these. Or you can buy it in the US from the US Council of International Business for $60. Honorable mention to Incoterms Rules for Americans, written and published by Frank Reynolds. Frank Reynolds is the only American that's in the room when they negotiate the Incoterms for each cycle of renewal. So he composed a book using the Incoterms rules guidance, as well as some of the International Chamber of Commerce standard contracts and ways to approach Incoterms rules from the American perspective, a very useful tool. And you can buy his book directly from him as well. So when do we select the Incoterms rules? This is a thing that I see a lot of companies getting wrong, or at least using suboptimally. The best time to start using Incoterms, to introduce Incoterms rules into your international transaction, is during pricing and quoting. At the very onset of the conversation with your buyer or with your customer or with the supplier, talk about what the roles and responsibilities are going to be, because they're going to influence the price that you end up seeing or the price that you end up giving. Knowing how much responsibility and risk you're taking on, or how much risk and responsibility your counterpart is going to be taking on, is going to influence how you set your prices. And you never want to have a price switch midway through after you've already agreed to something. So the best time to start talking about Incoterms is when you first start talking to your international business partners. The second best time is during the contract and purchase order phase, when you're actually creating the agreement between the parties for a particular transaction. You want to codify the Incoterms rules in that contract or on that purchase order and address them with particularity and with specificity. We'll talk about how that affects legal effect here in a moment. But you also want to have those Incoterms not just talked about during pricing and quoting, but once you settle on which rule is going to be in effect, you want to make sure that's written into your contract and your purchase order. And lastly, you want to make sure that your shipping teams and the receiving teams on both ends are aware of which rules are in effect before the shipment occurs. You want to make sure that that is mutually understood between both sides, that any supply chain partners in between the carriers, the forwarders, the customs brokers, that they're aware of any of those key considerations. When you don't want to do the rule is after shipment has occurred. You cannot retroactively apply Incoterms. There is no presumption of Incoterms application when it comes to international shipments. If there is no Incoterm rule in effect at the time that is agreed to by both parties, then it's going to default to any other terms or terminology referenced in the contract, and then it's going to fall into international law if there is nothing that is addressing how to resolve those things. So you definitely want to be paying attention to Incoterms throughout your international transaction and get them on the documents and agreed to between both parties. The Incoterms rules, again, should appear in key places and at key times. The buyer and the seller should have them and should be able to see them in the terms and conditions, on the quotes, on the contracts and purchase orders, and on the shipment documents. You want to see them in all places so that there is no confusion. That is the best way to avoid conflict and confusion when it comes to an event occurring where there's a dispute between who's responsible. That information is critical. So high level, what do Incoterms rules do? Incoterms rules assign responsibility, they assign cost, and they assign risk. either to the buyer or the seller. They're assigning it to one of those two parties and to nobody else. Incoterms rules will clearly state that the buyer is responsible or the seller is responsible. The cost is on the buyer's shoulders or the cost is on the seller's shoulders. The risk is accrued to the buyer or the risk is accrued to the seller. And those don't all have to be in agreement throughout the course of a single Incoterms rule. You can have different costs and different risks split up between the buyers and the sellers. And you need to understand kind of when those things come into effect. Incoterms rules answer questions like who arranges for the transportation, who pays for the transportation, who is responsible for any loss or damage during transit. That's what Incoterms rules are providing, is that assurance that there is a specific party that has that responsibility, that cost, and that risk. Incoterms rules do not address title transfer. This is one that so many U.S. companies get wrong in terms of international business. We're very used to title transferring for domestic transport at a specific point in the transaction, either upon shipment or upon receipt by the customer. But in international terms, when the goods are on the waters for sometimes 30, 45 days, when there's many carriers in that chain of custody that are handling the goods, title transfer is a completely independent consideration from the Incoterms rules. Again, we're only talking about responsibilities, costs, and risk. Who owns title and when you recognize revenue is a completely separate consideration that needs to be addressed separately in the purchase and sales contracts. Things like title transfer, invoicing, revenue recognition can happen at any point of the transaction, whatever is specified in the contract, regardless of what rule, Incoterms rule is in effect. So the Incoterms rules will not influence title transfer or revenue recognition. I want to stress that as hard as I can. You can have a delivered Incoterm rule in effect, and title will transfer as soon as the goods are loaded on the first carrier. Incoterms rules do not address payment terms. There are different ways to agree to how money is transferred between the buyer and the seller, or between the shipper and the carrier, or all those things. Incoterms rules are not going to have an impact. They're not going to recognize or address payment terms at all. You can have net 30. You can use a letter of credit. You can do cash in advance for any Incoterms rule. It won't have any impact there. And lastly, Incoterms rules do not create legal effect. They are not a regulatory mechanism. In fact, the U.S. government does not, within its regulations, address Incoterms rules at all. The export regulations for the U.S. are the foreign trade regulations, part of Title 15 CFR Section 30. Those foreign trade regulations talk about routed and non-routed transactions and do not recognize Incoterms or their impact on those routed or non-routed definitions. If you write your Incoterms rules into the contract, then they will carry the legal weight of the contract, and they will be enforceable in a court of law if there's ever a dispute by the weight of that contract. That's where you can get your Incoterms to be enforceable, is when they're written into your contract. But if they're not in the contract and they're just appearing on your commercial invoice when you ship the goods, and there's no agreement that that rule is going to be in effect elsewhere, then it may not carry any force of weight from that contract. You need to have an agreement in place in order for the rules to be effective. Hopefully that makes sense and everybody understands when to or what they do and what they don't do. Aside from that, we want to talk about some of the key terms that are used either directly in the Incoterms language or by people when they are discussing or negotiating Incoterms. One of the first terms is the word delivery. You would think that the word delivery means when the goods are given to the buyer, but that's not the case. Delivery, within the meaning of Incoterms, is where the risk of loss or damage passes from the seller to the buyer. That risk of loss or damage doesn't have anything to do with possession of the goods. It has to do with where the seller and the buyer have agreed to accept that risk. And the Incoterms rules will specifically address that point of delivery, what needs to occur for that risk to transfer from seller to buyer. When the goods are manufactured, the seller still has all risk and responsibility. And then at some point during its journey from the seller to the buyer, that risk of loss or damage is going to transfer to the buyer, and that is your point of delivery. The word packing in the meaning of Incoterms means fit for transport as defined in the sales contract. It does not include stowage within the container. So when they talk about packing responsibilities, they mean making it fit for transport. They don't mean loading it into a container or wrapping it in a nice box with a bow on it. They're talking about making it ready to be transported. Whatever it takes to get to that point, that concludes the packing responsibilities. Stowage within the container is its own consideration within the Incoterms rule. And then there are three kind of legs of transport that we like to recognize, and the Incoterms rules will uh, address in different measure. The first is pre-carriage. That pre-carriage is the transportation from the point of origin to the port of departure. That's all of the transport in country from where the goods are picked up to where they get on whatever vessel or container that they're going to be using to go internationally. The main carriage is the transportation from the port of departure to the port of arrival. So that's the on-water transport or in-air transport is the main carriage. The on carriage is transportation from the port of arrival to the point of delivery. So once it arrives at that destination port and gets off the boat and goes by truck or whatever means to that final point of delivery, that's your on carriage. So your pre-carriage, your main carriage, and your on carriage are your three legs. Those three legs are usually very clear and defined for air and ocean transport. It gets a little tricky with rail and truck. And when does pre-carriage start or end? When does main carriage begin? It's important to kind of pay attention to that terminology so that you can see which parts of the Incoterms rules are going to be impacted by different modes of transport and in which ways. So Incoterms have some key importance. They create that shared baseline for buyer and seller, primarily to overcome language barriers and reduce those chances for miscommunication. In fact, the Incoterms book is translated into 27 languages, the most common languages in use in global commerce today. And you can refer to an Incoterms rule in your own language, and the party on the other end should be able to recognize all of the risks, responsibilities, and costs that are accruing to them in their own language. That language barrier, reducing that language barrier, is a key role for Incoterms to play. The Incoterms are going to also clarify that role and responsibilities for the buyer and seller. You're going to hear me say the words buyer and seller 10,000 times during this conversation. The important thing, the reason I'm doing that is because Incoterms rules are for the buyer and the seller only and nobody else. Buyer and seller. And Incoterms are playing a major role in the increase in globalization. Creates more opportunity for buying and selling across borders by businesses of any size. In the last 20 some years, we've seen an explosion of e-commerce and small businesses being able to grow by selling and reaching international customers or by accessing parts and materials from abroad to manufacture goods here. That communication and shared understanding is more important than ever. As more and more people are entering that global marketplace, that opportunity to have miscommunication is going to grow exponentially. Incoterms help reduce that opportunity for miscommunication. So you want to take advantage of them in every transaction, and you want to help educate your partners, your suppliers, and your customers on the Incoterms rule that you want to use for this transaction, for any transaction. So now we're going to take a look at the Incoterms rules themselves. But first, a quick poll. So, which of the following Incoterms benefits would help you and your business the most? Is it the avoidance of unexpected costs and fees? The understanding the responsibilities between buyer and seller? Is it protection for your business by minimizing risks? Or is it to improve negotiations and contract clarity? You have to pick one of these. This is intentional. I want to see which one of these things is going to be most important to you. All of these can come into play from Incoterms. There's no trick question in here. There's no wrong answer. This all has to do with your prioritization for Incoterms rules. So you can't get this correct or incorrect. All right, we'll go for another about 15, 20 seconds again. Still getting a few more responses trickling in, and we'll wrap it up here. Okay. So it looks like everyone is trying to use the Incoterms to understand the responsibilities of the buyers and sellers. They're using it as creating that baseline for communication. I don't know if you answered that because that was what I was just harping on most recently, and you thought that was the correct answer. But Incoterms are an essential tool for sharing that understanding between those buyers and sellers. So I think that's a fantastic reason to use them. Minimizing risks is the next most prevalent answer here. And I think as we're seeing over the last, just forever, the risk of loss or damage in transit can become, it can happen suddenly without warning and can be devastating to businesses. I have a few examples that we'll look at later on of instances where that has occurred and what the impact would be in some of those situations and avoiding unexpected costs and fees in international shipments. That is one of the often overlooked benefits. Those hidden costs and fees. Everybody kind of recognizes that there's going to be freight, but then there's going to be a lot of ancillary charges, and we're seeing more and more of those charges show up on invoices from carriers, from forwarders, from brokers, and understanding who's supposed to be paying those costs is a key aspect of ensuring that your profit margins or calculations are correct, that your landed cost estimations are on point, and that you're going to be able to continue doing business. Those costs, that distribution of costs and responsibility for paying those costs is really important to get right, especially never more so than recently. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the rules themselves. And oops, let me stop sharing this poll. My apologies. We're going to take a look at the rules themselves. And I'm going to harp on the difference between multimodal and sea and inland waterway only, because 7 of these rules, the multimodal rules, are the ones to be using for uh, a significant portion of international commerce. You would use the multimodal rules, XWorks, FCA, CIP, CPT, DAP, DPU, and DDP for all transactions where the goods are containerized or packaged. If they're packed up or they're going into a container, you want to be using a multimodal rule. Those containers, they're made to be loaded onto a truck or onto a train to get from point A to B for the pre-carriage or the on-carriage. And so once it goes from one mode of transport to another mode of transport, you're in the multimodal rules and you want to be using one of those rules. The sea and inland waterway rules do not protect the transaction for any of the other modes of transport, and you're often limiting what Incoterms rules are supposed to be doing for you. The sea and inland waterway only rules are FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF. They're very similar. The FAS and FOB are very similar to FCA, and the CFR and CIF correlate most closely with CIP and CPT. Seen in the waterway only is for transport by water only during the journey from the seller to the buyer. It is not appropriate for most international trade cases, at least the ones that I deal with the most. You're looking for bulk and break bulk cargo and shipments, things where there is some level of visual verification available of the goods when they are loaded upon the ship. If you can actually see the goods themselves, they're not packaged up, they're too large to fit into a container, and that visual inspection can occur, then seen in the waterway only might be most appropriate. It's also commonly used when people have businesses along the Mississippi River, and they can load directly onto a barge and move out to sea from there. So there's a lot of circumstances where you could and should use these seen in the waterway only, especially in other countries. But for most U.S. businesses shipping on in containers or on LTL or LCL, you're likely going to be using one of the multimodal rules. So X works. I'm going to hit the Incoterm rule. We're going to progress through the list, basically moving the risk from the seller to the buyer as we go. And I'm going to talk about where the transfer of risk or responsibilities are occurring based on the words on from the Incoterms rules themselves. I'm not going to spend too much time on these, but I want to cover them so that everybody has the frame of reference. For X works, the risk transfers from the seller to the buyer when the goods are made available to the buyer at the named place. So basically, they're ready to be picked up, and the seller has made them available for the buyer to come and pick them up. That's where the risk transfers. For FCA, free carrier, risk transfers when either A, the seller places the goods on the buyer's conveyance at the seller's premises, or B, when the seller has delivered the goods to the buyer's named place of delivery. FCA is very, very common when the seller is loading the goods onto the truck at their facility. You can have FCA your own facility, but the buyer is the one who has sent the truck. Excuse me. So the other common use of SEA is for the seller to bring it to a port or a loading terminal for it to be offloaded and then later on put onto a boat or a plane. That's a common use of FCA. FAS, which is a sea and inland waterway only, stands for free alongside. Risk transfers when the seller places the goods alongside the ship at the named port of shipment. This is how you use FAS correctly. You basically get it to that loading point and you drop it off alongside that ship at that port. And then we get into FOB, and I'll talk about this a little bit more heavily. FOB means free on board, and the risk transfers when the seller places the goods on board the vessel at the named port of shipment. So all the risks and responsibilities and costs are on the seller until it gets over that rail and is on board the vessel. The FOB Incoterm has no relationship to the FOB, meaning within the Uniform Commercial Code here in the US. The Uniform Commercial Code is the standard code that applies to all interstate commerce. And FOB is defined there, and there are two versions of FOB in the Uniform Commercial Code for the US interstate transactions. There is FOB origin and FOB destination, and they have no correlation, no correspondence. There's no direct applicability to the Incoterms rule FOB. So if you're a US business and all of your transactions are FOB right now, that's because you're not using the Incoterms rules. You're probably using the UCC. And if you're trying to apply those to international commerce, you're going to have a bad time. So I would definitely encourage anyone who has a preponderance of their transactions being done as FOB, their international transactions as FOB, to reconsider whether or not you're supposed to be using a sea and inland waterway only Incoterms rule. If FOB turns out not to be the correct one to be using, then you should be looking first at FCA. That is the closest correlation the to FOB UCC term. Okay, that's all I'm going to say on FOB right now. We'll get into it if people have more questions. CPT, this is one of the first rules where the risks and the costs diverge. They do not transfer at the same point, and it's key to recognize that this divergence happens. For CPT, carriage paid to, the risk transfers when the seller loads the goods on the first carrier. So the risk is transferred as soon as the goods are loaded on board that first carrier. And then the seller is responsible for costs to the named place of destination. So the seller has the risk until they're loaded, and then the buyer has the risk. Once they're loaded, the buyer is responsible for anything that happens in transit. If something goes wrong, it's going to be on the buyer's responsibility to resolve it. And in the meantime, the seller has selected for, paid, and arranged for the transportation all the way to that named place of destination, which could occur anywhere in country, depending on how the rule is set up. So you have a disagreement between who's paying for what, who's arranged for what, and who's responsible for what. It's important to pay attention to that. CPT tends to favor the seller. Effectively, they get to control the movement of the goods, and then they have to pay for it, but they can pass those costs along to their customer. But they don't have any of the risk if something goes wrong. So they've picked all the modes of transport, but if something goes wrong, it's not their responsibility to deal with it. So it's an imbalanced rule in that way. And if you're selling your goods internationally, this is one of the recommended ones to use. It provides you with the most advantage in most cases. CFR is a sea and inland waterway only correlation to CPT. So CFR stands for the cost and freight, and risk transfers when the seller loads the goods on the first carrier, and seller is responsible for cost to the named place of destination. CFR is also in the Uniform Commercial Code. So for the domestic U.S. Sales under the UCC. And It does create some confusion, not nearly as much as FOB does in my experience, but there is some confusion being created. So if your transactions, again, are using CFR for most of your international transit, but you're not using sea and inland waterway only transportation for the entirety of the transit from the buyer to the seller, then you're probably not using CFR correctly as an Incoterm. You will want to look at that. And if you're trying to correlate, or the closest correlation to the Incoterms rule would be a CPT rule. CIP is cost and insurance paid to. CIP is the first of two rules that specifically address insurance coverage. Otherwise, the rule is exactly the same as CPT. The risk transfers when the seller loads the goods on the first carrier, and then the seller is responsible for costs to the named place of destination, including insurance. That's the difference. And for CIP, this is your maximum cover. This is your Class A insurance. The presumption of insurance coverage that you have for CIP transactions is that Class A. And with CIP, it is directly added to, effectively, that insurance is directly added to a CPT term. So if you want insurance to be called out and you want the seller to have that responsibility for that insurance, you can do it with CIP. The sea and inland waterway only correlation to CIP is CIF, cost, insurance, and freight. Same thing, risk transfers when the seller loads the goods on the first carrier, and seller is responsible for cost to the named place of destination, including insurance. So CIF and CIP are very, very similar, except one is sea and inland waterway only, and one is for all modes of transport. Then we get into our D terms. There are three D terms, and it's when you think of D terms, just think of delivered. DAP is the first one. It stands for delivered at place. Risk transfers when the goods are available for unloading at the named place of destination. So the seller has gotten them to a named place, and they have borne all costs for delivery to that named place of destination. And the buyer simply receives them, unloads them, and receives them at whatever that named place was. This is your first delivered pricing type of term. Very common to use, puts a lot of the responsibility on the seller, but it makes it very easy for the buyer, which can be very advantageous. If you're selling your goods and you want your buyer to say yes to your product easily, DAP comes to mind. Or if you're a buyer and you don't have a lot of support to pick up the goods in foreign countries, then you want to buy on DAP terms because it's easier for you. After DAP, we have delivered at place unloaded. The risk transfers when the delivery occurs to the named place of destination and the goods are unloaded. Unlike DAP, this actually specifically requires that the goods be offloaded from whatever conveyance were used to bring them to that named place of delivery. This isn't a very common Incoterm rule to be using. It is not customary for foreign sellers to take responsibility for unloading in a foreign country. So for that reason, it's uncommon, but there are certain classes of cargo and types of situations where, for example, sensitive machinery, where there is a certain degree of responsible care that that the seller is taking on, is a scenario where delivered at place unloaded might come into play. And the seller bears costs for delivery and unloading at the named place of destination. And then the last Incoterms rule that we're looking at is the DDP, delivered duty paid. Risk transfers when delivery occurs at the named place of destination free and clear. Seller bears all costs and customs responsibilities through to delivery at the named destination. DDP has never been more problematic to be using for international transactions. That duty obligation within the last week has just become a significant burden of responsibility. So if you're buying from your supplier's DDP, you should expect the prices to be going up. There's significant new tariffs going into it that are in effect as of April 5th, unless something has changed this morning that I haven't seen yet. And you should be paying very close attention to what prices you're paying when you're buying on DDP. Similarly, when you're responsible for selling DDP, you're going to need to navigate whatever tariffs are in effect on your goods going to your customer in that foreign country. If you're shipping from the US, you can reasonably expect there to be things like retaliatory or reciprocal tariffs going into effect on those goods. So if you're picking DDP as your Incoterm of preference, you're going to have more responsibility for paying attention to the particularities. It is very, very common for importers in their own country to be responsible for customs clearance. So if you're in the US and you're buying on DDP, you might want to think about stepping up your international game to get your own broker and take control of your own business because it's unlikely that too many buyers will be shouldering that going forward. It's certainly not at a cheap rate if they are. So definitely pay attention to your DDP transactions. Some of the scenarios that do occur at sea, these are some of the ones that have made headlines over the years, recent years. The Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Baltimore. And then the Amna capsizing while being loaded in Istanbul. The one in Istanbul is a great example of being very particular about where the risk and responsibility of loss or transit occurs in transit. Some of the containers had been loaded onto to the vessel and some had not been. So knowing which Incoterms rule is in effect is essential. For the Baltimore Bridge, many containers were damaged, many cargo or things were lost, and knowing who had that responsibility while those goods were in transit, Incoterms rules would speak directly to that. There was the MSC Zoe disaster a few years back. 297 containers were lost at sea due to strong rolling caused by sea conditions at the time. And even though it was determined in the investigation that the containers were loaded according to regulations, that investigation and those findings led to a change in the regulations for stowing very large container ships. So nearly 300 containers were lost at sea during high winds, big waves. So, and one of the other common risks are delays. Uh, when goods are stuck at sea for any period of time, like when the Suez was blocked and many containers had to reroute or were stuck at anchor, or when there are port strikes, or when there is turmoil at the ports because of COVID and things like that, um, all of these can lead to problems with a lot of containerized cargo, especially if it has expiration dates, pharmaceuticals, things like that can be in there, food, all kinds of categories of goods can expire because of delays. And being very clear of who owns that risk and responsibility when those delays occur is essential. And we're also seeing, again, new challenges over the last couple of months having to do with goods being held up in customs because of tariff related reasons or a failure to pay duties that are due at the time of import. So the importance of communication is ever present. I probably argue this every year, but I would argue again, never more so than today. Incoterms rules will help improve understanding and protect both the buyer and the seller. Uh, you want to make sure that you're answering several key questions. Do both parties recognize which rule controls the shipment? Do they recognize what the rule means for the contract and purchase order? Do both parties recognize what the rule means for the shipment? And how can you improve that communication? Take advantage of those different language translations. Send your customers an Incoterms book or have them order one for themselves in their own language so that you can reduce miscommunication. Train your people internally so that your sales teams, when they're negotiating sales to foreign buyers, they know which Incoterms rule to be talking about. Talk to your purchasing team so that when they're buying goods, they know which Incoterms rule is in effect and what exposure the customer has, or sorry, what exposure the company has when those goods arrive and are due for customs clearance. If they don't think about those things, they can find very, very big problems. Some additional thoughts that I'm not going to get into too deeply, but I want to mention here. Incoterms modifications. You can modify the Incoterms rules as written. It is tricky, and you want to be very, very precise in how you modify those rules. And you want to pay attention to whether or not there's just a better rule that fits in the first place. But you can do those sorts of things. I've had clients do DDP excluding taxes. They were willing to handle the customs clearance, but they wanted the tax obligation to accrue to a different party than themselves, and they were able to create that scenario. So the shipper from the U.S. shipped it overseas and was responsible for the import clearance and payment of duties, but the taxes accrued to a different party. Landed cost calculations. This is another tool that should be in your arsenal for calculating how much it's going to cost to get goods from A to B. Incoterms rules will influence what goes into those calculations. If your selling X works, the number of variables that you need to factor in is much lower than if you're selling DAP. So knowing how to use landed cost calculations. If you need help applying landed cost calculations to your business, especially right now, maybe give us a call or send us an email after this. And lastly, your supply chain partners, your brokers, your forwarders, your carriers, the people that are responsible for getting the goods through the next gate effectively in that international journey, making sure that they're aware of what Incoterms rules are in effect, that you've talked to them verbally. You actually used your words, not just sent an email off to a general mailbox and explain to them what you're trying to achieve. And that will help them navigate scenarios that come up. If the goods get held up in customs, if there's a disaster at sea, if there is some other complication that arises, you want your partners to be working with you from the jump, not spending valuable time getting up to speed on what's supposed to happen. Largely, one of the things that helps the most with that is making sure that your documents are all in agreement. It helps to reduce the time to succeed at issues that arise. And our last poll here, we are planning for an Incoterms in-person session later on this year, this fall, and we are gauging interest. So if you would like to learn more about Incoterms in person, please feel free to answer our webinar. This will help us prioritize or answer our poll. I don't know what I said there. So yes, please tell me more. Yeah, but Ohio's too far and I prefer somewhere else. Not this year. No thanks. You answered all my questions today. That can't be possible. I appreciate the offer, but I could probably give the training for you. Some of you in the audience, I'm sure, are very skilled at Incoterms, but maybe we'll reach out to you for help with that Incoterms presentation. Kind of while you're answering that, I'm going to bring up a QR code. When the webinar ends today, you'll be taken to a page, but you can go there now on signing up for the waiting list for the Incoterms in person and taking a look at some of the factors there. Here at Star, we're big fans of building up the international trade community. We like empowering people with education, and we think in person is one of the strongest ways to do it. We recognize the limitations from these webinars. So if you're interested in that in person, definitely take advantage of the waiting list that you'll see there. We're also looking to hopefully partner with Frank Reynolds, at least to get his Incoterms for Americans books in the queue for those trainings, and it'll be a good opportunity. Frank used to tour the country and teach his seminars in person for years and years, but then COVID happened, and now he's freelancing a little bit, and we're partnering with him to the best of our ability. Looking at the Incoterms in person, there's a pretty even split across the board of interest for a live session on Incoterms. So we'll factor that into our calculations. Thank you guys for responding to that quick poll. We also have some upcoming webinars. You can get there from the QR codes, or when we send out the materials, you'll be able to click the links on the slides here. Our customs broker exam prep course will be kicking off. So actually the customs broker exam is happening in a couple of weeks, and the next course will be starting up, I believe, in late May or early June. So if you're interested in becoming a licensed customs broker and working with us to do so, you can take a look at our prep course. And as always, we provide webinars for the industry at large every month. If you'd like custom training for you or your business, please feel free to take advantage of those as well. On the screen here, we have the education code, hopefully in a font that is easier to recognize. Please jot it down. Take note of the code on the screen here. If you're interested in registering for our upcoming webinars, we have two in May. I want to say thank you again for joining us today. This is the code, again, for your continuing education credits at the bottom of the slide. We're also putting it into the chat. I need to mention that out loud. So in the chat, that code should be there for you to copy and paste. On May 13th, CVP and their partner accreditors, including the NCBFAA and ICPA and a few others, will be joining us to help answer questions that you've got about your broker continuing education credits. If you have questions on how to make use of these continuing education credit codes, or having troubles getting them to work in the right places, or not sure how Customs is doing the enforcement of this, that will be a great opportunity in May to join that continuing education for licensed customs broker webinars where CBP and several other industry partners and affiliates and accreditors will be in attendance. A week after that, Joe Harper will be giving a webinar about the process of becoming a licensed customs broker. If that is something that is of interest to you, this is a great opportunity to learn what it means to become a licensed customs broker. Joe teaches our broker exam prep course, and in this webinar, she'll give you some pointers on how to best prepare for the exam. With all that said, we have about 10 minutes for Q&A. So I will do my best to get through the questions as best I can. So bear with me. Here's a question from Christine H. What would be the best Incoterm to use if I want the seller to be the IOR and the buyer to manage the freight? Is there one that is close to that? So the buyer has all risk and responsibility for the freight, but the seller is the IOR at the point of destination. There isn't one that really deals with that. You would have to modify an existing Incoterm. And since the buyer is managing the freight, you would probably be selling this on FCA terms, and the buyer would then therefore handle all the freight. And then you would have to specify in the FCA Incoterm that the seller would be the IOR. Did I get that right? Let me pause a moment. Yeah, on an FCA term, the buyer manages all the freight, arranges for and pays for, and has all the risk for the goods while in transit from that point of delivery. And the seller would have to accept a pretty random responsibility to be the importer of record in that foreign country. I don't recommend doing that, but that's a way that you could do that. Hopefully, I answered your question there. Oops, do that. From Leslie, I have a vendor who ships DAP buyer's warehouse. Originally, they used a U.S. freight forwarder to handle the on-carriage to our warehouse, so we were only responsible for customs clearance duties and taxes. However, they now changed the setup to carrier door move under a straight bill with no U.S. forwarder to handle delivery. They made this change without approval or prior notice. Now we have to issue a delivery order to the carrier, ensure it is picked up on time, monitor the container while out. Where would this fall under the Incoterms? So you have agreed to DAP buyer's warehouse. It is the seller's responsibility to bring the goods to the named warehouse. You're the buyer, you've named the warehouse, it's their responsibility. If they are shirking their responsibilities, you have the right to dispute those actions, look for chargebacks, look for them to bear the costs of and the responsibilities for the freight. I'm not sure what has caused them to stop doing this, but it's probably fixed through the right kind of conversation before you go any legal routes. But under DAP, they would have that responsibility. I would open up dialogue with the buyer and say, look, we agreed to DAP buyer's warehouse. That's what we've been doing. And we need you to bring these to this point, or we need you to reduce your costs to offset our inconvenience. And then you put a new Incoterm rule in place, or adjust the one that's already there. But yeah, under DAP buyer's warehouse, they have responsibility for demurrage on paper. So you can start getting lawyers involved if you want to. So is FCA similar to XWorks? It is slightly similar, but XWorks is not a good term to be using for an actual shipment, in my estimation. I want to qualify that. Under XWorks, placing the goods at the disposal of the buyer effectively makes it the buyer's responsibility to load the first conveyance. And here in the US, for example, it's usually against OSHA regulations to allow a third party to load a truck. You don't have them come in and drive your tow motor or your forklift to load their own truck. Typically, the plant will load it for them. So XWorks typically does not actually reflect what happens in practice when selling from the US. And similarly abroad, if you're buying on XWorks, you're going to have responsibility for all of the export clearance requirements from foreign countries, and that is challenging. Under FCA, that risk transfers when the goods are loaded and ready for export. So there is an responsibility on the seller to ensure that the goods are cleared for export versus X Works where the goods are just made available to be picked up. There's nuance there. I would definitely recommend looking at the Incoterms. If you're looking at a least responsibility that is appropriate to most circumstances, I highly recommend FCA as the Incoterm in effect. I use XWorks for quoting purposes. If I want to compare apples to apples prices, I'm going to say, look, give me your X Works price just so I can understand what the goods cost. I'll worry about all of the other layers to getting the goods to me later on, but tell me the X Works price so I can have that in my back pocket so I can talk to other suppliers of that same material on an X Works basis. When I go to buy it, I'm going to buy an FCA or a C term or a D term. So they are not the same, but there are some similarities, and depending on certain types of transactions, they can be very, very close to one another. How often are the sellers willing to take more of the responsibility? That depends a lot on industry. But turn the question back on yourself. How much responsibility do you want when you're selling internationally? And you can reasonably expect that your buyers are going to want to have the same or less responsibility when they're selling, or your suppliers. My terminology is getting turned around as I'm reading these questions, but um, really you have to talk to them. You have to have a conversation, engage their abilities. Large companies typically have whole teams of people that will just take care of all this stuff, and they'll have better pricing with the carriers and better processes for getting goods cleared, and all that stuff will be kind of handled by a larger team. If you're a small operator, you want to have less responsibility because you're not going to be as well equipped to navigate challenges that arise. I know that we're approaching time. For anyone that does have to bolt at 11, thank you again very much for being around. We appreciate your time. I'm going to continue answering questions. So if you do have a question posted, I will attempt to get to it. I'll probably go for another 10 or so minutes after the end of the webinar. So just bear with me. So yeah, talking to your sellers is the best way to gauge their willingness to accept responsibility. And it's a unique conversation with each seller, each supplier. DAP are import costs on the buyer. Yes. Well, depending on which import costs we're talking about, I'm assuming you're meaning customs clearance costs. For DAP, customs clearance would be on the buyer. The person in the country in which the goods are going to be imported would have the responsibility for import clearance and therefore all import costs, including tariffs. What Incoterm did you say was closest correlation to UCC FOB? So the closest to UCC FOB is FCA Incoterm. It basically just prepares the goods for pickup and for export by the buyer. FOB origin and FCA are very close to one another. If you're looking at FOB destination, then you might be looking at a DAP term, the complete opposite end of the spectrum. I should clarify that FOB can go both ways when you're talking about the Uniform Commercial Code. So I would start by looking at FCA and see if that correlates to what you're trying to achieve. Oh, there's a clarification to one of the earlier questions where the seller is located in another country but has a US presence. And you want the seller to be the importer of record, but you want to manage the freight movement from the country to your warehouse. Um, okay. If you want the seller to be the importer of record coming into the US, so they basically their US division would be the IOR. I would be looking at a DDP uh, and then just clarify in the contract that you're going to be taking responsibility for moving it on your own contracts with your own freight forwarders. Either spell it out and maybe use DDP excluding freight as the kind of shorthand version of that term, but then be clear in a contract or purchase order or terms and conditions that you will be handling the arranging and payment of transportation costs, but under the DDP term, they would have the responsibility for customs clearance here in the US. Or alternatively, buy from the US business and have it be a sort of a triangle shipment where you pick it up overseas, but it's a domestic transaction. Yeah, that's tricky. It's tricky. There's not going to be a great Incoterm answer for that question, Christine. I'm sorry, but it can be done, and it takes a lot of communication and coordination with with the brokers, with the forwarders, the carriers, with the seller and the buyer, and the U.S. arm as well. What Incoterm would you use if your buyer is responsible for the freight costs from the USA factory to their USA forwarders warehouse, but the seller is responsible for the risk, making sure the freight is delivered to the USA forwarders warehouses? Is everybody here in the US? Um, Stefan, I'm not sure if your buyer is responsible for the freight costs from the US factory to their warehouse, but the seller is making sure the freight is delivered to the forwarder's warehouse. I don't think I understand your question. I'm sorry. If you want to send an email afterwards, maybe we can hash it out that way. But it's not it's not working for my brain right now. I'm sorry. Uh, from Charlene again. Who is ultimately responsible for deciding on the Incoterm used? Is it it's purchasing? Is it sales? Who is it? It is literally an agreement between the buyer and the seller. And usually that responsibility should fall on whoever is negotiating the rest of the contract, whether it's the price or the terms and conditions. Whoever's agreeing to that on both ends is the party that should be locking in the Incoterm and should understand what it means. And they're often going to need help because they don't deal with this stuff. But like if a lawyer is the one that makes your contracts, instruct them to include certain approved language. And then if your salespeople are negotiating the terms of the sale, like, hey, yeah, we want this at this price on this date in this quantity, and like, well, we can only provide this much on this date in that condition. Uh, Include the Incoterms, include that transportation into that discussion so that you can get exactly the deal that you're looking for. So it's going to be yes, purchasing, yes, sales, yes, legal, yes, finance. All those people have a stake in what Incoterm ends up going on to the documents. The people that don't have a stake in it tend to be the logistics people. Uh, all of that should be decided before it ever comes to logistics, but we often see that logistics people are the ones informing purchasing and sales on what to look for. So I definitely recommend having Incoterms agreed to during that negotiation between the buyer and the seller, whoever those negotiating parties are. And if they need to have logistics in the room for that piece of it, then fine. Um, who is the importer on DDP terms? And just to clarify this, I know it's hard to keep straight. The importer on a DDP term is going to be the seller. The foreign seller has responsibility for customs clearance in the destination country. So if you're in the US and you're buying DDP from China, then the Chinese shipper is responsible for customs clearance here in the US. How they do that and what that looks like is often not going to be your concern. You're going to be paying for it one way or another, not directly. Usually, you're going to be paying it in the price of the goods that you're buying. But you would not be the IOR on those shipments if DDP is being done correctly. And flip it, if you're selling DDP from the US to another country, the importer of record is going to be you as the US party selling into the foreign country. You have to be the importer of record in that foreign country. Can you do that? Do you have presence there? Are you registered with their tax regime? Do you have all of the standing to be the importer of record in that country? Probably not. And do you have to go through a bunch of hoops to be able to get the ability to do that? Probably. It's a little bit easier for multinational corporations that have hundreds of locations around the world that are willing to work together and be that importer of record for the mutual benefit of the overall business. Certain things like that can occur. But the importer on a DDP term is going to be the seller, the way that it's written. If the Incoterms on the shipping documents differ from the Incoterms in the contract due to human error, would this create a conflict when determining when transfer of risk or loss of goods occurred? It sure could. Um, in my experience, the contract is going to be the governing document if there is a dispute, and most of the time you're only going to need to worry about this if something has gone wrong. Otherwise, you want to fix it on the go forward. But if the contract says words to the effect of the Incoterm rule in effect on the shipping documents is the governing Incoterms rule for that shipment, then you can have whatever Incoterms rule on the documents, and that's going to be reinforced by the contract. Um, if you have a specific Incoterm rule defined in the contract, all transactions will be shipped FCA. You might also have a clause in there that says, unless otherwise decided or prior to shipment, or words to that effect, in which case your documents might override the FCA that's written into the contract. So knowing what the words say and what they mean in practice is the only way to know the true answer to your question there. But if it's due to human error, one of the ways to get ahead of that is to issue a correction, an apology, or something like that, saying as soon as you become aware of it, hey, we accidentally shipped these goods. The paperwork said FCA. It was supposed to be DAP. Ignore what the paperwork says. It is DAP as per the contract. In communication, again, I can't stress how important it is to communicate, and you can head off so many problems by having good communication. Okay, those were all the live questions. Now I'm going to look at the questions that were pre-submitted. Maybe I did this in the wrong order, and I apologize. From Marty H. in Battle Creek, Michigan. Is the seller or buyer responsible for container charges at loading facility? Container charges at loading facility on an X Works, it would be the buyer that is responsible for all container charges and responsibilities for loading at the facility. On X Works, it is the buyer. For everything else, it should be the seller. And I do believe the Incoterms books will specifically address loading and unloading responsibilities and be very, very clear in each case about to what degree that gets covered. From Kelly and Allison in Hunt Valley, Maryland. Who is to file the ITN based on FCA Incoterms? Wanting to know more about the info on relationship between Incoterms and routed transactions. Are there any more commonly seen with routed transaction? This is also with Jordan M. in Cleveland. So a lot of people had questions about the ITN or the EEI or the routed transactions. And this is a question I see come up quite often. Uh, Incoterms have no direct relationship to routed or non-routed transactions, have no direct relationship to the foreign trade regulations, to the EEI, or to the ITN number. The US government, whenever I've asked them, would decline to answer the question with Incoterms being part of the question and would only answer the question when using the words routed and non-routed. And you have to kind of do the application to which Incoterm rule is in effect. You have to do that yourself. That being said, with the full acknowledgement that the U.S. government does not acknowledge Incoterms rules as part of the regulatory landscape that's in effect, the most common correlations that I see are that routed transactions tend to be X-Works and FCA transactions. Those are your routed. All of your standard, your non-routed transactions tend to be your C and D term transactions. So E and sometimes F terms as routed is the most common that I see. It is not legal advice. It's not customs business. That just tends to be the case. So on an FCA Incoterm, who is to file the ITN? It's going to be determined by the routed and non-routed status of the transaction. If it is a routed transaction, which should follow with an FCA Incoterm, then the FPPI, the foreign principal party in interest, would have the responsibility of authorizing the agent and causing the EEI to be filed. So if everything is lining up the way it's supposed to under an FCA Incoterm, the FPPI is responsible for the ITN. Hopefully that gave a clear answer. If you want to know more about routed, non-routed transactions, we do have recorded webinars. You can look at our webpage that will have one of the ones I did not that long ago. I want to say maybe October-ish to get some more intel there. I do talk about Incoterms a little bit there. From Janet J. in Springfield Gardens, New York. DDP term pertaining to the additional tariffs. Yes. So with DDP terms, this is one of the advantages, considerations is a better word to use here. The additional tariffs, let's say coming into the US, if the goods are moving on a DDP term, the additional tariffs are going to need to be paid by the importer of record. That's who's responsible. And under a DDP term, the importer of record should be the seller, or at least at the seller's direction. Um, if this is a normal financial transaction, any smart seller is going to try and pass those costs onto you in some way, but they are going to have that responsibility to customs to pay the duty on a DDP term. Um, yeah. So hopefully that answers your question, Janet. Robin H. DDP, Robin H. in Edders, Pennsylvania. DDP, does this mean the supplier pays state sales tax? No. So DDP only has to do with the import clearance into the US. That's the only additional consideration. And coming into the US, there is no sales tax on imports for US imports. There are taxes on imports into other countries, but you're referring to state sales tax here. State sales tax should only apply on intra-US sales transactions. If there is some other sale happening after the fact between parties in the U.S., which shouldn't be the case on the import, but um, then it would still be the follow the normal state sales tax things. You kind of pass the DDP transaction rule there. So, however, the sales tax would normally be accounted for in that transaction between the two U.S. businesses that are engaging in that business, then sales tax would follow those rules. But for the import, there should be no sales tax coming into play whatsoever. For things like VAT taxes and GST in foreign countries, DDP implies that you're going to handle any import VAT and any import GST alongside any duties or tariffs that are due at the time of import. But again, US has no import tax. Deanne L. in Cedar Rapids, Iowa is asking how to apply when moving goods domestically. I'll go for a couple more minutes here just to get through these last three questions. How to apply Incoterms when moving domestically. I mentioned it earlier, but just ignore the international aspects of the Incoterms rule. And there's guidance in the Incoterms book that will help you do that. An R. Hegde in Bangalore is asking, I want to understand which term is always benefit for us as for cost-wise benefit. And the answer is it depends on your capabilities. Are you going to be shouldering the cost by having personnel dedicated to navigating the Incoterm, the shipment responsibilities, in which case selling on a D term might make the most sense, or buying on an E or F term might make the most sense? Or do you want to shoulder the cost through your contracts and your freight carriers and that sort of thing? You have to know what your capabilities are to know which costs are beneficial for you. Do you want your seller to bake the costs into the price of the goods when you buy them? Knowing where the cost goes. There is no one Incoterm that is best. It's all determined by what your capabilities are as a business. Carly M. in West Deptford, New Jersey, deducting freight based off of Incoterms. Yes. So when importing into the U.S., you can use non-dutiable charges, and freight costs can be part of the non-dutiable charges when importing into the U.S. Depending on which Incoterm is in effect, that could help guide what documents you need to used in order to deduct those costs. But if you're buying at an F term, you don't have any non-dutiable freight in the cost already. But if you're buying on a D term, you might have some dutiable or non-dutiable freight that you are paying duty on, in which case you need rated bills of lading and other documents. So you don't really base it strictly off of the Incoterms. It has to do with what price was declared as the customs value, and you want that to be only inclusive of dutiable charges and not at all inclusive of non-dutiable charges, which could include freight. So it's a broader question than just the Incoterm, but generally speaking, if you're buying on an F term, there's not going to be much an E or an F term. There's not going to be much dutiable freight to think about. If you're buying on a C or a D term, there could be some ocean or air transport that is deductible. Tyler M. in Garrettsville, Ohio. What Incoterms when drop shipping from a vendor's factory? Okay, that's a complicated question. For drop shipments, triangle shipments, things like that, the Incoterms in play are going to have a lot more to do with which parties are actually involved in the transaction and to what extent. But if the seller is selling to you in the US as the buyer, the point of departure for the Incoterm is kind of irrelevant. That original point of origin. If it's from their factory, let's say that the seller is based in Vietnam, their factory is in China, and you're in the US, the transaction, the financial transaction between you and the seller in Vietnam is one thing, and the Incoterms can be FCA China warehouse or words to that effect. So the Incoterm in play is not going to be over influenced, but you need to understand what the nature of the transaction is. And the last question I'll answer right now at 11:15 is from Celia, I'm sorry, Celia in El Paso. Are customs broker's fees applied in addition to the customs value? For a DDP shipment, an import coming into the US, customs broker's fees would accrue to the seller. So yes, the only time import clearance is considered in the Incoterms is in a DDP shipment. Otherwise, it's just implied that it is the buyer's responsibility. But in a DDP shipment, the seller would have all responsibility for all customs charges associated with getting the goods delivered free and clear to the buyer here in the US. So you would assume that all customs fees, all customs brokers fees, all taxes, all surcharges, all MPF, all HMF, all of that goes to the seller on a DDP transaction. All right, I am going to stop the recording now because I just thought of it.